Labrīt, cienījamie skatītāji, mans vārds ir Mārtiņš Daugulis, un man ir liels prieks visus sveikt augsta līmeņa fórumā, kur vērt naudas līkumi, jeb ceļš uz drošām finansēm Latvijā. Fórumu ikgadējās kampaņas ietvaros zini naudas likumus un līkumus, tā ietvaros, ko organizē Finanšu izlūkošanas dienests sadarbībā šogad ar Latvijas Republikas iekšlietu ministriju, kuras telpās arī šodien atrodamies. Diena solās būt piesātināta, saturiski diskutēsim par naudas atmazgāšanas situāciju un tās novēršanu Latvijā, lūkojoties uz to, kas ir paveikts, kas šobrīd ir aktuāls un arī skatoties, kādi ir nākamie soļi un nākamās tendences. To visu vērosim caur divām prizmām, caur mūsu pieredzi, mūsu pašu institūcijās un no starptautiskās perspektīvas un pieredzes. Tā arī sadalīts mūsu dienas izkārtojums. Pirmajā dienas daļā vairāk raugāmies uz Latviju, otrajā dienas daļā savukārt uzklausīsim kolēģus no starptautiskajām organizācijām. Šajā gadā formā īpašs uzsvars mums tiek likts uz ēnu ekonomiku Latvijā, uz tās tendencēm un ietekmi kopumā uz valsts attīstību. Un diskusiju sadaļās, kas mums paredzētas, raudzīsimies uz to, kā veidot draudzīgu vidi, atvērtu vidi, kurā šie riski, ēnu ekonomikas, pelēkās naudas riski neienāktu un uzņēmēji būtu motivēti darboties godīgi. Globālās tendences naudas atmazgāšanas novēršanas jomā un ko tās nozīmēs lokāli šeit Latvijā, arī mums fóruma dienas kārtībā. Fórums šobrīd tiek vērots gan FID mājaslapā, gan Facebookā, gan arī portālā LSM.LV.
Today we are broadcast on LSM.LV as well as Delphi, and we have two working languages for the foreign English and Latvian. We have an intense day ahead of us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ilza Znotiņa, the head Evika Siliņa, the parliamentary secretary of the Prime Minister of Latvia, who will give us the opening address. Good morning, dear colleagues, as far as I understand you hear me. Honourable Madam Minister, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I am extremely delighted to welcome you to a forum which focuses on socially important issues, which is money laundering. I would like to first of all thank all the business owners who, despite the pandemic and government financial sector overhaul, managed to improve their finances and their business practices and thus promote fair competition and safe financial flows here in Latvia. We first created the government or the public system, then you, the businesses, private sector, also created a system which no longer tolerates dirty money which used to flow from Russia. Now, considering the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we have had to reorient our business away from Russia and now also Belarus. The successful financial sector overhaul undoubtedly gave us opportunity to show that we're a reliable NATO partner and ally. We did our homework. It was important to implement those activities to make countries like Canada, Spain, Czech Republic, United States trust us and deploy their troops to us and thus contribute to our collective defense and security. And I would like to thank everyone for doing their best to make sure a financial system is reliable and trusted, no matter from which background you come. And now we're ready to share our excellent experience with our colleagues in Europe, because as you know, sanctions against Russia are unprecedented, in terms of scale, also unprecedented, and Latvia has experience of weathering the Russian sanctions, and sanctions will of course affect our daily work, but those sanctions were important to stop further aggression in Ukraine from spreading outside the Ukraine and to protect ourselves. As regards to the future, the Prime Minister just met with the new Secretary General of the OECD, with whom we discussed various improvements, but the Secretary General of the OECD also praised Latvia for making a really significant progress, and he applauded our progress and even said that he, to some extent, envies our progress. Shadow economy and fight against or combating of shadow economy is high on our agenda. Next government meeting will adopt the shadow economy combating plan. We are working on a new approach towards cutting back the shadow economy. We would like to give more flexibility in terms of risk management to private sector. We talked a lot about de-risking during the financial sector overhaul. Now we have to focus on risk management with respect to the grey economy, shadow economy, to give also additional flexibility to state revenue service in terms of managing taxes, managing risks and tax collection. We will, of course, work with the businesses that are important for our economy, and companies need to invest in taxes and in fair competition to make sure that Latvian children and adults have access to quality education and good health care. We could all contribute to a stronger defense security system domestically. When there's no better time than now. We need to focus on security and safety right now. And we can be proud about our progress. Indeed, we did our homework. We pooled our resources and focused on anti-money laundering measures, and we improved our system. Although it took us a lot of effort, a lot of resources, it has been very productive, very fruitful, because right now we know how to respond or how to act in the light of the sanctions imposed against Russian oligarchs. This is the sort of the environment in which we are at the moment. Wish you a productive forum. Would like to thank the FIU and all the cooperation partners for this excellent workshop. Without further ado, would like to finish my speech, because I know that you have very interesting discussion with very esteemed experts today. Please use this opportunity to pick their brain, and thank you for joining our workshop. Good luck to you all. Thank you. I would like to once again thank Evi Kasili, who's the Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister of Latvia, and thank you for somewhat, linking all the issues together, how money laundering, sort of overlaps with the grey economy. Money laundering has been considered as an obstacle for the national development, but now it is also a matter of national security because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the sanctions imposed because of that. Now let's move on to the presentations, but Before the presentation, I'd like to give the floor to the Znotiņa, director of the FIU from anti-money laundering in Latvia, from reforms to results, the main risks and future trends. Thank you, Martin. I would like to thank Madam Siliņa for a wonderful introduction to our forum and giving us a lot of inspiration for today's work. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, I'm absolutely delighted to open the 4th annual forum, bringing us together to focus on very important issues linked to money laundering and terrorism financing, counter-terrorism financing. Today we bring you a forum, bylaws, highways and byways of money towards safe financial sector in Latvia, which kicks off a month-long public awareness campaign organized by FAO together with partners. Our forum will mostly focus on AML, the current situation. We would like to give you an update of what we have done in recent 4-5-year period. We would like to also identify the key risks right now and what are the future trends globally as well as domestically here in Latvia. When we started working on the organizing of this forum, we couldn't have imagined that we would be even mentioning all the complications that have arisen from the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the war waged by Russia against Ukraine, not because it is our neighbor with whom we have close historical, cultural and political links, but also because our financial sector will definitely have to restructure, and the impact on our financial sector from this war will be really significant. Russian aggression against Ukraine is a true threat to us, and our thoughts and our hearts are with Ukrainians right now, and we just need to, continue doing what we do, and this is how we can help Ukraine. And the primary task of the FIU is to counter money laundering, counter terrorism financing, counter evasion of sanctions, and as regards to our primary duties, as I have reiterated a number of times over these years, it's not only about economic growth or prosperity. Money laundering, terrorism financing, sanction evasions are a direct and threat to the national and global security. In 2018, Latvia was shown a red card by the international organizations and international partners. We were reminded that we have failed to create a safe financial sector, a reliable financial sector that is capable of dealing with money laundering and terrorism financing in an efficient manner. Although it was a crisis for us, a deep crisis for us, we turned this crisis into an opportunity. This crisis gave us an opportunity to create a system which properly manages risks, and we started deleveraging or de-risking the financial system. We got rid of high-risk corporation partners like shell companies. We provided better access to all kinds of information, especially information about the final beneficiaries. We also amended sanction laws, which are, specifically relevant right now in terms of our sanction laws and regulations. We're a role model to other countries and to other nations, and because we have clearly identified short-term and long-term priorities that we should focus on through this law. Looking at what is happening currently in Ukraine, we vividly see how important it was for us to overhaul the financial sector, banks, companies, reporters, and all the stakeholders know what it means to know your client, what are the criteria. We know what partners we want, which clients are we ready to service, and which money flows we will allow into our country. The work that we have done over the past couple of years has put us in a much better place compared to where we were, a couple of years ago, and where we are compared to other countries. Our country, like our economy and financial sector, and each and every business are much more safer than they were a couple of years ago. They don't need to worry as much. Sanctions will have impact on all financial sectors around the world, and financial service providers and banks. It's not something new for us. Our major test came in 2018 when Latvia was the first country in the world whose sanctions and understanding of sanctions was praised, was considered very, very low, and we had to step up very significantly and had to champion this, sanctions process, and that's why we were the first one to organize sanctions-themed conference 2 years ago. It was attended by international experts, FIU experts from different countries, financial and capital markets, monitoring commissions. They came to our first conference to arrive at the best possible solutions through the discussions, and we have these conferences annually, including last year when we focused on Belarusian sanctions. Now we're in a different and much more complicated situation. On one hand, we could say that anti-money laundering measures have a direct impact on the economy and our growth and national development. Money laundering directly impacts our prosperity and the health of our economy, its stability and its capability to fight corruption and tax evasion. And it also makes other crimes less likely, thus contributing to the sustainability of Latvia as a country and as in the economy. Fight against the types of crime that we are going to discuss today not only undermine the rule of law, but also undermine those companies that are competing fairly. So there's a direct link between our ability to prevent such crime and the strength and the economic potential of our country. And that's one of the objectives of today's forum, to look at the global trends, to look at the reforms initiated by Europe and what is happening here in Latvia, to understand what should be our next steps to create a more robust AML, CTAF and a non-proliferation system in Latvia, and thus strengthen our national security and promote our growth. I would also like to underline that an efficient government is a government that is capable of controlling its territory, a government which is open, reliable and engaged, focused on economy, zero tolerance against any crime, and promoting equality and social inclusion. That is why FIU has been offering this forum, which focuses not only on AML but also on shadow economy and much more broader spectrum of issues. In conclusion, I would like to underline that our understanding, our perception has changed considerably over the past years on understanding of safe finances, safe business practices, what it means to be a reliable, accountable and trusted international partner as a state. And I think today we can safely say that any foreign investor knows that Latvia is much more knowledgeable and reliable country in the region as regards to the AML and CTF. We know how to cooperate, how to make meaningful collaborations, how to share information, how to learn from each other. Our rather difficult road to becoming the first Moneyval member state that has complied with all international standards, has been the path that has consolidated us and created, a core of government institutions responsible for these issues, as well as awarded good cooperations with our private sector partners. And that isn't by no means a coincidence. It is a result of a hard, dedicated work, and we should all pat ourselves on the back. So I'd like to encourage everyone to be active during these discussions and contribute to even stronger Latvia and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Notiņa, for inspiring words and also for this rich information given at the beginning of the forum about what has been done, what has been achieved, and also opening this question, what the situation is now and what should be done according to good governance. Logics of good governance. We usually act on the basis of data, and that's why I'm very happy to give the floor to Dr. Arnis Sauka, Professor, Head of the Center for Sustainable Business at Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, Chairperson of the Council of Ventspils University, and the topic is shadow economy and its impact on business environment, investment attraction, and economic competitiveness. Well, thank you, Martin, Mārtiņš, and thank you, Ilse, for this introduction and for inviting me to share my experience about shadow economy and ways of decreasing it. This is not a topic that really makes one happy when speaking about it. It's really a problem in Latvia and Latvia's development. But of course we have other questions and issues, education reform, green course and efficiency, productivity and so on. And this time really shows very well how nice it is to talk about challenges for development and not other problems. So thanks God, at this point we don't have to speak about it in the framework of the Union, but I agree with Ilse, what she said, that we have to do our best to do our jobs, because only by becoming stronger and by promoting development we can be strong enough to help others and to be strong partners of cooperation in many areas. And of course, one problem for development is shadow economy, and my presentation of today will be dedicated to it. But before I begin, here we see the structure of tax revenue from different taxes, and the total tax revenue, the money that we get to do good things, to provide services, and to deal with many problems in development. For example, we see social insurance contributions and VAT. These two are very important, and according to the information given by the Statistical Bureau, it's 9.361 billion euros, and we also know the GDP. And in our study, in studying shadow economy, we use different methods, and to the extent of our knowledge, this was done for the first time. We looked at all these types of tax revenue to understand what we are collecting and not collecting, so what is bypassing the state treasury. Tomorrow we are going to present this at the Ministry of Finance and the Council of Science, and we will provide in-depth analysis. But our data shows that by using different methods, because all these types of revenue require, well, different analysis and methods, but if we have 9.361 billion, and if we would have no shadow economy, no tax evasion, then looking at all the activities that could be taxed, and I'm not talking about drugs, such activities which cannot be taxed and cannot provide tax revenue, then we should have 12.107 billion, so approximately 2.745 billion. This is not exact science, of course. We looked at the limits, the lower and the higher limit. Lower 2.036 and upper 3.576. This is the amount of lost tax revenue due to shadow economy, tax evasion, and smuggling. So 2.745, this is approximately 9.3% of GDP. That would be, so we see that we lose approximately 22.7% of all tax revenue. So these are huge numbers, but it is not surprising. The percentage is not surprising. Because also during the annual shadow economy conferences, we have been presenting these numbers already for many successive years. So approximately 25% of GDP are not collected as taxes. But of course, we have to look at each type of tax revenue separately and understands the problems. And of course, the labor tax is one group where we have the greatest losses. 77% of all lost tax revenue, these are related to labor taxes, the so-called envelope, salaries, different schemes, how to avoid. And here we see also the calculations in the table, very briefly presented. And again, we see that the amount of shadow salary, of those shadow economies, those salaries paid in envelopes, the amount and the percentage is very high, and it is higher than in the other Baltic states. So this really needs, so we have to pay attention to it. The next, and then excise tax, again 10% of lost tax revenue. Oil products dominate in this group. Tobacco products, this is also a very serious element in this block. And again we see the table, the uncollected taxes. Again, we see oil and gas 129 millions and alcohol 54 million. So big money. Now value-added tax. Actually, Latvia has been quite successful in decreasing VAT, and also VAT evasion is not that big. It's 9% of all lost tax revenue. Well, but it also depends upon the method that we use to calculate the lost or uncollected VAT. We also have to speak about uncollected income tax from 57 million euro up to 59 million. And again, the question is, what kind of impact does it leave upon business environment, attraction of investments, competitiveness of economy? Of course, it has a certain impact. We know that in Estonia and Lithuania and Poland, in some of those aspects, the situation is even worse. But if we look at Russia, applying the same methodology, a shadow economy there is almost 50%. So there are countries that are facing even greater problems in these terms. But we should not look at the former republics of the Soviet Union, but perhaps we should look into the other direction. And finally, a context for this discussion that will follow. What should we do? What should be done? What kind of policy we should choose? What should we do to decrease money laundering and shadow economy and the similarities and differences between what Ms. Notiņa is doing in her daily work and what other institutions should be doing. What do we have in common? What we see in this context? What has happened also? If we if we invest sufficient resources in these problems, and if these are set as priorities, then really a lot can be done, especially regarding combating money laundering. Of course, due to external pressure, this turned into a priority for the state, and this really helped Latvia to deal with many things and to resolve. And Latvia, headed by Ms. Notiņa, Latvia had great results, and we escaped serious problems that we wouldn't want to see in our financial sector. So we had resources, coordinated actions strategically and operationally. So external pressure for decreasing shadow economy, we experienced it during the crisis of 2008 and 2009. Now know, well, in terms of strategically coordinated actions, like group, which is doing, of course, the strategic group is doing a good job, but we need daily cooperation and collaboration. And of course, we have to fight shadow and combat shadow economy and also money laundering. Well, there are some things that the banks can do, but of course we can never have the situation where all businesses would be satisfied. They had certain problems and certain things had to be done before and should be done in the future. Probably we will discuss later. But the greatest difference is that even if these activities are illegal in Latvia and salaries paid in envelopes or illegally, these actions entail criminal liability, but the approach is different. If we are fighting against money laundering and these criminals as criminal organizations, we know what should be done. We have very good tools, but with respect to shadow economy, we are sort of combating or fighting with these companies and businesses who are paying some taxes. Some are paying taxes and some are not. So this fight is much more complicated and complex. And it has, we have to take into consideration legislation and many other aspects. And what we are going to discuss tomorrow, we have to discuss policy lines, and we have defined these just to show the scope, the needed scope, and especially when we cooperate and when we introduce strategic measures. And we also have to take into account the citizens' trust in services provided by the state. We also have to think about proportionality of sanctions. We have to speak about taxation policy, both subjectively and objectively, how it functions. And again, several aspects should be taken into account. And so we have provided those policy recommendations, also tax morale. We are discussing different industries. Where we see tax evasion and shadow economy. And again, we have to take different policy approaches to different sectors. And well, we've seen that a lot has been done with respect to dealing with money laundering, but Latvia has not been yet as successful with respect to decreasing shadow economy. But definitely policy makers are now choosing a different approach, new approach, data-based approach. The only concern that we have is that as part of this national research program, and since we have been given resources to conduct those studies and to provide data, then hopefully probably the new plan will not include these recommendations that we are bringing now. So the question is the extent to which these data are used. And again, perhaps this could be discussed later during discussions and debates. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation.
Thank you again, Professor or Director Dr. Sauka. You will stay with us until discussion, and you will be ready to provide your input in finding solutions for the business sector. I mean, shadow economy, combating solutions for the business sector, as you mentioned correctly. it is quite a challenging area, and it is not as straightforward as money laundering and fighting organized crime. So therefore it is very important to have you also for our discussion how to create a friendly business environment. What does tax morale mean? You know, that is something that we will be keen to find out from you during discussion. Now I'd like to introduce the General Director of State Revenue Service, Eva Jansson, who's going to talk about AML and shadow economy in Latvia trends and current challenges from the State Revenue Service perspective. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and I would like to ask the technical staff to share my presentation that I had been promised will be shared on screen. Yes, thank you for having me. First of all, I'm very pleased and delighted to follow Mr. Sauka because he actually showed many of my slides, so I will be able therefore to add my perspective to what he said about those slides, but I fully subscribe to the idea that cooperation between researchers and policymakers is absolutely crucial, and that's why I'm absolutely certain. I can't speak on behalf of the Cabinet, of course, but as soon as those commissioned research findings are out, as soon as they are published, Ministry of Finance will be ready to adjust its plans to achieve the set goals, because it's not about plans or research, but it's about being goal-oriented and achieving actual results. Now, as regards to the plan, please, next slide. You know, it's much debated document and its activities have been widely discussed, and I've talked about this with Mr. Sauk a lot, and I fully agree that each, item of the plan should also give us a clear, cost, or rather financial savings that we will be able to generate. And of course, many people have questions about, taxing those who pick berries and mushrooms and whether we should hunt them down. And of course, not all of these measures give us a clear fiscal benefits or gains, but this plan is nevertheless very important for us to be able to structure our work. And what Mr. Sauka also said about tax morale, it's very also important. If we have a comprehensive plan which covers all stakeholders, nobody can actually sort of slip away. So that's also important as far as the accountability is concerned. Out of 43 different measures out of this plan, 34 are in the competence of State Revenue Service, so we have enormous responsibility, but we should also focus, or rather we should improve the situation in major sectors, because we are a tax management or tax administration, and we can't really do everything when it comes to sectors that are employing tens of thousands of people. Next slide, please. As Mr. Sauka mentioned, where are we losing money? It's not only the personal income tax that sort of creates this tax revenue gap. We have excise, value added, and also social contributions, and there's also a gap in terms of personal income tax. And how does this gap grow? Well, it's generated by us. Instead of paying what we're supposed to pay, we pay less, and this is where this gap occurs. And this is not something characteristic to Latvia only. And then money laundering, those are businesses that contribute to these gaps, to these holes and shortages when it comes to tax revenue. So any intervention, any activity that we are going to implement will impact us, each and every one of us, and we think that, of course, these activities are very useful, and that some groups of population will then also support them. As regards to the tax morale, the more people support the tax morale and tax accountability, the more prudent they'll be about paying their taxes. This shows the tax gap for petroleum products. You can see that we have actually managed to reduce this gap 2 times. Yet at the same time, we can also see that any country, and Latvia is not an exclusion by any means. We have, this problem of last mile. What do I mean by last mile? We have an indicator where reduction will require huge resources. Any further reduction will require huge resources, and of course we can, achieve a certain reduction, but it will be very, very expensive. And when it comes to excise tax, I have to say a big thank you to our partners who have contributed a lot. I'm talking about legal, petroleum dealers, and I do think that all of you remember the times when we didn't know the origins of the fuel, the petroleum. We could see, tanks along the way, and the fuel was delivered in all kinds of peculiar, let's say, ways. And as regards to money laundering, of course, petroleum sector has always been very, dishonest, very dirty business. We're living in a different world today, of course. We still can achieve improvements, but it's again a question of cost, whether it's not going to be too high. So this is one of our success stories I would like to proudly announce, and I'm not going to point fingers at any other countries, but there are many countries that are lagging far behind us in this regard. From 2010, from enormous volumes or amounts, we have come to very small amounts when it comes to VAT gap. And again, this is the last mile, phenomena here. We could achieve improvements, but they would cost us a lot. And we have doubts about methodology, and that's why we haven't reflected certain data here, because COVID has significantly affected the statistics, and we have to really dig into the reasons behind those sort of fluctuations to properly understand what is going on, what trends are we seeing. But what I can say with quite big certainty as regards to VAT, and this will also concern the personal income tax, we can see how AI has improved tax collection. Anything that can be sort of made into an algorithm, anything that can be automatically processed will be much more efficient, and this is what puts us ahead of other countries, or countries that are trying to follow our example, and all of them will claim that AI has improved it a lot better, and without AI you have these 30%, 30% gap. With AI you can reduce any losses, any mistakes, and be much more efficient. And this brings us to the next slide. Here you can see that our achievements are not as good as we hoped for, and we are stagnating a bit. If you look at 2008, you will see the 30% again. It's again 50% reduction, but unfortunately it's been a lot slower. It's taken us a lot more years because there are a lot more companies, a lot more business entities, a lot less chance to apply AI, and you have to go on an inspection on the site and check the paper trail physically, and this is where the tax morale would play an enormous role. We cannot reduce this, and we cannot catch everyone by hand. So this is much more about the tax accountability, the morale. If you look at these figures that we have already achieved, what you can see clearly is there's 2 billion that Mr. Salko has estimated, and I would hope that we would be able to collect it in terms of taxes and transfer it into our budget. And of course, by working individually, we're of course collecting more. Every year we're adding millions in terms of tax collection, but this is far from billions that Mr. Salko has estimated. There's a huge untapped potential, but again, a question about working indirectly. on reduction of this gap, and what we are currently focused on, what we have also proposed to the legislature, is to switch from direct to indirect approaches. Indirect approach would be based on the estimates, like the personal income tax or capital gains tax, for us to be able to be much more efficient in terms of tax collection, because indirect sort of reduction of this gap gives us wider array of weapons, of tools, bigger toolkit to work with, which is also cheaper compared to current quite expensive approaches that we are using, because we have to do so by law. We're obliged to do so by law. Well, and this is exactly what I'm being criticized heavily a lot about, and all the politicians who try to introduce mandatory minimum social contributions are criticized for, here's the impact on the shadow economy. And often we get criticized that everyone who's in precarious job is breaching the law, but the reality of life, in fact, has shown that if you work part-time, that's when you need certain incentives. We're no different from other countries in this regard, especially developed countries, because the shadow economy estimation methods and calculation methods develop greatly between developed and developing countries. We are a developed country, and we face the same problems as, say, Germany, France, Spain, other developed countries. People are working, in the officially, and they are either paid, partly directly and partly under the table, and they are working extra hours for undeclared pay, and the percentage of people in the grey area is very little. And as Mr. Salk already indicated when talking about his research, they trust to their employers more than scientists, teachers and SRS, State Revenue Service experts, more. So anything that is not really obvious is something that we cannot influence, and we are not only working in the fiscal interests only, and there are quite many people who get percentage of their pay in other ways, in other forms, not officially. And this is where I should put a stop, because here's my contact information here. If you have any information to share, of course nobody among the viewers and participants are engaged in undeclared work, but whistleblowing and reporting is picking up in popularity as well, and our former employees are also reporting quite a lot. Competitors are also, reporting or giving us hints about unfair business practices of their competitors, and this is how sort of business environment cleans up by itself. If clients and partners or employees are not willing to compete with those who are evading taxes, then we have better chances of cutting back the shadow economy. I would like to refer to our previous year's discussion that we are continuing, and the expertise on which we rely with construction sector, with Security Corps and with cleaning companies. They are, reporting, they are blowing whistle on unfair practices themselves, and now they are much more interested in detecting undeclared work, because that definitely hurts everybody, and now they are realizing it themselves as well, because people are deprived of social benefits, social security that way by engaging in undeclared work, and they're engaging in unfair competition, unfair practices. And the reform with regard to many taxes has already also contributed to sort of cleaning up of our labor market. And the next steps with the resilience resilience and recovery facility funding will also give additional improvements, and as I have already mentioned, if we together will be able to achieve progress, then it will be very, very welcome. So any sort of contracts between employee and employer, unfair practices between them, if they are not willing to break up this vicious cycle, are almost virtually undetectable, because then you have to put a policeman next to each, sort of employer or employee. So I'm very thankful to Madam Znotiņa for organising this forum to raise the overall sort of awareness of the importance of these issues. I would like to also underline that, value-added tax is the one that is closely connected with the money laundering, because you have the same sort of articles of crime and the same sort of elements of crime. You can't say the same about undeclared work or under-the-table payments, because they use different approaches. Of course, money laundering is an important element of the undeclared work, but the difference is that you have to pay wages on a monthly basis, and once you don't pay a wage, you get dissatisfied employees. Creating a steady flow of dirty money is very, very difficult. It takes a lot of sort of expertise and sort of mastery, but you can of course do that. But if your VAT's gap is, say, 30%, then you know that legal companies went to organized crime, and everyone were working with organized crime, and everyone is surprised and saying, I did it just once. But there were real companies, good companies, sort of fair, honest companies with good, clean image, and then accountants were crying and CEOs were crying, but they were cooperating with criminal organizations. And now we have to be very careful about where these monies originate from, the monies that are paid under the table in envelopes for undeclared work. And we can see that a lot of these sources are here in Latvia, where sort of dirty money comes from a private sector, and construction sector in particular is keen to use sources such as construction of private houses. That's where the sort of the undeclared, the dirty money comes from, and is then reinvested into the village. So construction sector is a sort of, again, the vast field of work for us, and it is contributing to the biggest share of shadow economy. And cleaner construction sector would give, would reduce this gap, tax gap, a lot quicker than, for example, in the case of the cemetery. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the whole, research of SALK being released, because this is the first time that Latvia is seeing such a wide and progressive research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jaunzeme, and please stay with us here, because we are now moving in to discussion how to develop a business-friendly environment. Jānis Salmiņa, who is Deputy State Secretary on issues of tax administration and combating shadow economy of the Ministry of Finance. She has joined us. Ilze Znotiņa, Ieva Jaunzeme. So we have Ilze Znotiņa, head of the Financial Intelligence Unit, Ieva Jaunzeme, then Santa Burgaile, chairwoman of the Financial and Capital Market Commission, and Professor Arnis Saugo, who was the second speaker during our first part, who is the head of the Center for Sustainable Business at Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. The title has been worded in a quite lyrical fashion: how to develop a business-friendly environment. How do we understand the friendliness? Who should be friends with whom? Who is friends with whom? And so what kind of obstacles we have to being friends in the name of our development? But of course we can rephrase this topic. Self-regulation, better relationships with public administration, and so on. So what's your take on it? Who should be friends with whom, and what kind of obstacles we see? We will give, first of all, floor to those who have not spoken yet. So Jānis Salmiņa, please. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to participate in this event. what was already said, these limiting those envelope salaries, this is one of the priorities which we have placed in our plan. And we are dealing not only with these sort of aspects, ethical aspects, but also the possibilities where these monies are found to pay salaries in envelopes illegally. As Ms. Jonze told us, and also Professor Sauka mentioned, this is a large part of economy which is living in a gray zone, and intentionally or unintentionally, all of us could be involved in this. Not always really, we don't know always that the payments that we make are made in clean economy. Perhaps at that moment you have the feelings that you have paid indeed, but the information that the State Revenue Service receives is different, and we have different ways for evading taxes, and so people get resources for paying salaries illegally. So during the last 2 years, we would perhaps, when speaking about friendliness, we might say that we are looking for possibilities for sharing information between public administration and the NGO sector and companies to identify the risks on all levels of government, and then those who are and then the State Revenue Service would not visit those who have no risks, and those who are dishonest, then they could be visited by the State Revenue Service. So, speaking about friendliness, at this moment I would say that we should be friends, public administration and the companies, and we should identify the true risks. At least at the Ministry of Finance, we can now theoretically, so we can imagine how this is being done and discuss it with the State Revenue Service. But entrepreneurs, especially if a sector has some kind of specific features, they could tell us where we have some gaps in regulation or perhaps some deficiencies in inspection methods, and this all might lead to cleaner environment, and also that would give us grounds for being more optimistic, and also more optimistic with respect to taxation policy. Thank you, Ms. Salmiņa. So the vision is quite clear, to separate those who are good from those who are bad, and have engage in actively in forming and developing friendships. Ms. Burgaile, from the point of view of the Financial and Capital Market Commission friendship, well, let's begin by trying to define what friendship is. This is mutual respect, common values, cooperation, one common aim. So, perhaps we should take this as a starting point and then think how different institutions of the public administration, also business environment, how we cooperate and how we can help each other to reach the aim. In my opinion, this is a huge problem, and it has been in Latvia for quite some time. We keep speaking about shadow economy, and we cannot say that all are either black or white, but we have to find ways of how to create the right mechanisms. And we see already we've seen some kind of initiatives regarding cooperation between private and public sector, and some initiatives have been very successful. And in the current digital age, it's very important to have information, to have data, so we can analyze these data jointly and use the data, apply the data. And so we have to work in a very focused way with the sector that presents problems, and sort of living in peace, let's say, those who are in this sufficiently wide side, to let develop their business. But indeed we have to develop mutual trust. We must know that those who are on the white side indeed deserve being there, and others understand what kind of risks exist, how we identify the risks, and how we develop mechanisms for managing the risks, and finally how we arrive at the point where we have some kind of mechanisms of sanctions, which is sufficiently strong or comprehensive to deter potentially from committing the crime, because tax evasion and corruptions, these are all crimes. These are internal, but these are crimes, domestic crimes here in Latvia. And now Mr. Sauka. Well, the same question, what does friendship mean? But linking this together with what was said, white and black companies, you are a researcher, you already mentioned and said that the situation is quite complicated, so white and black and developing systems, your take on it? Thank you. The more we move towards development, of course, the better we understand that this is not a simple matter. Well, and speaking about friendship, actually, the definition provided by Ms. Purgal was quite interesting, cooperation and mutual respect. But I would like to highlight 2 points, and perhaps there are others that we might discuss. One is how different institutions maintain their friendship, all those institutions which are involved in dealing with these problems. And also, of course, we have to assess the resources that should or should not be invested. Now, in our research program, we have to be friends with specialists of finances and anthropologists and so on. And all these specialists have been trained in different methodologies. They think differently. It's not that easy to cooperate. And yet, in order to provide recommendations on how to decrease shadow economy, we have to be friends. We have to overcome those methodologies and the thinking that we have in order to cooperate and collaborate. It would be nice for public administration to overcome some bureaucratic and some institutional aspects, to collaborate better and work more effectively on operational level. Actually, well, if we speak about shadow economy, of course, we need cooperation between public administration, the State Revenue Service, Ministry of Finance. But we don't see here participating Ministry of Welfare, of Education and Science, of welfare. So not all institutions are involved. And the second aspect, the friendship between government and businesses. I believe that for businesses it's very important what they get, what they get in return for paying taxes, what kind of services they receive. All those things that we have been discussing in different contexts, also in the Council of Foreign Investors. And also the state should really look at it, what it gets in return for what it gives. So we have been always speaking about the carrot and the stick, but and again, all those businesses, those companies who pay part of taxes and do not pay part of the taxes, those who are not even registered, who are engaged in illegal activities, we can deal with them in a very simple way. We just have to deal with them. But those who are sort of grey, half and half, we also have to deal with them, but in different ways. And again, this aspect of being friends with, it becomes more important. And now, Ms. Jaunzeme, I see that you are connected. Yeah, I see you as well. Well, how to define friendship and being friends? I believe that in my presentation I already mentioned this, that we have seen a very sort of significant, turning point. Previously, companies were not coming to us, but now we have those focus groups, and they come and they talk to us, and they sort of deal their cards openly, and so we really see that companies want to work in a different way. So this is a first positive step. If it would happen in all sectors, that would be the ideal situation, then the progress would be much faster. So about being friends, indeed, this is mutual respect, as Ms. Purgaile mentioned, and what we are doing at the State Revenue Service and what we want to include in the law, in legal acts, this whole story of segmentation. Indeed, we are classifying companies according to their performance, and those who are very good, to avoid any kind of speculations that the State Revenue Service keeps visiting those who are paying taxes and who are seen. We have been practicing this already for the third year. Those companies who have very good payment discipline, well, the State Revenue Service is not visiting them and is not interested in them. And if we would go there, then the entire society would know. So apparently they have some problems with paying taxes if they are visited by the State Revenue Service. So this whole matter of openness, of transparency is very important. And also, actually, it took us 2 years and effort to prove that we need to publish our decisions. Now this is happening since August, and we've seen no disaster. Companies now can see what kind of decisions we take, so no speculations really are needed. This is public information, you can receive it. So this openness is very important. It's very important in relationships. Whenever I have to give an interview and say I cannot tell anything, I cannot disclose anything because the law prohibits me from doing this, it really diminishes trust in the State Revenue Service, because I should be explaining what we are doing. So transparency, openness, understanding, and transparency of methods, this is what we need as public administration, as companies. And I will subscribe to what Professor Sauka said. The methods and methodologies differ in public administration. We have certain restrictions, at least in the State Revenue Service. We really want to take a very we try to take a very comprehensive look. But for combating shadow economy, especially regarding payment of salaries, the regulation on data is really influencing our work, because we always have to prove why we need the list of companies, and we also have to think the scope, starting from which eurocent we are starting assessment. So this data regulation has huge impact. And because we really have to prove for what kind of purpose we need the data, and the data must be used only for the purpose for which the data have been obtained. I believe that we still have this discussion ahead of us.
Thank you, and Madam Snotiņa. You are the last speaker in this session, so we expect a recap from you, being friendly, transparent, exchanging data. Madam Jansema mentioned not being, stuck or focused only on one particular area. Well, Matish, it's very difficult for me to sort of speak after Santa and how well she described friendship and to continue speaking in the same manner and in the same sort of way, but that only shows how strong our friendship is with her. And actually, if you look at the reasons why we have this workshop, why FIU and shadow economy, then we have to look at what a friendly and business environment is. And like any other friendship with anybody else, I want a friend who's reliable, can be trusted, who can support me, who is knowledgeable, or she, who is knowledgeable and, is interested or follows my best interests and is, curious. And, this is how I sort of approach any friendship between the FIU. And I've been working for 20 years in the private sector. And also, if you were to ask me what is the role of the FIU in the context of shadow economy and in general, what our purpose is, when we fight against money laundering or when we create new approaches, new systems, new models, we see that we can actually, replicate the same approaches in the fight against shadow economy, government fight against shadow economy, and we need to create friendships with businesses and cooperate with them. And Mr. Salkin already showed that, horizontal cooperation is very important. And if we wouldn't have created various collaborations or friendships in the money laundering area, we wouldn't never have reached the point where we are today, where we can rely on each other, where we can count on support of each other, and we can quickly contact each other. And the same should apply to the private sector. It should go beyond the government, and we would like to create similar friendships with private sector. But above all, we see that money laundering reform has identified a broader spectrum of issues that we need to focus on. Last year, FIU focused on corruption. This year, we focus on shadow economy. And there's a reason why, because I don't believe that businesses will, be ready to pay taxes or will try to help a government which is not capable of eradicating corruption. I don't think that mushrooms and berries are the biggest tax problems in our country. Our money laundering efforts are very important. That's the paramount objective. That's the sort of the umbrella priority. That's where the main risks are, and we should focus on major risks. And we have so little resources available as a small nation, as a small country. We can't spend, money on everything. That's why we need to focus. And we need to be friendly towards businesses, and they need to be friendly towards government. And let's fight against those who are scheming, those who are sort of whispering like a snake in the Garden of Eden, just saying, do the wrong thing, nobody will catch you. But, this is something that we should get rid of, and that's the sort of where the major thrust should be. And that's where the State Revenue Service, FCMC and FIU should act together, because we have succeeded in money laundering, and we should now apply this to another sector. Now, there are different sort of ways we could describe it: hot potato, elephant in the room, and, there is one sort of sore issue or problem child, the construction sector. What should we do with the construction sector to create the shift of paradigms, for them to become transparent, open, and to cut back, dirty money flows, enormous flows that they have? Well, as regards to FIU, we have a clear sort of objective when it comes to construction sector. We would like to analyse the money flows there, and of course there is the RFF funding available for the construction sector in particular, recovery and resilience facility funding available, and penalties have not been severe enough. There are huge companies, big holdings, big holding structures. Nobody knows who's doing actually what. It's all sort of very muddled, very difficult to understand. But there's also the road construction. Everybody looking at those potholes. I mean, the amount of potholes that we see now on the roads are making everyone wonder. So that means that something wrong is going on in the sector. I'm not so even mentioning other sectors that I could mention here, but we will collaborate with other relevant and responsible authorities on those. Yes, and what about you in the construction sector? Well, banking service providers and construction services have been working together for a long time, and banks know what is happening in sector. And again, you could ask why banks should sort of pioneer or champion the process, but irrespective of who should be responsible for that, we see that already things are happening. Banks, looking at what is happening with those holding companies in construction sector and various, monies being, channeled through and returning back to their initial points. So banks see all those. They see the scheming, they see what is happening. So banks can apply pressure to initiate change. Banks can start asking questions. Construction companies, where does the money come from? Why are you doing this? What's the purpose of this transaction? And the responses are, of course, reactions are different. Businesses say, that doesn't concern you. That's my sort of business secret, and you should know that. But banks are asking this question because they want to make sure they need the assurance that it is not just a shell company to avoid taxes or just, avoid money being reported, money flows being reported. But we also hear these stories that banks are asking questions and about 10,000 being wired and people being shut down because they exceed the thresholds. So, is there a balance between monitoring banks do before they're closing down clients and, not overburdening fair businesses? Yes, that's why in recent years risk-based approaches have become very popular. And we have tried to convince everyone of the need to implement risk-based approaches, and we should start with banks, of course, not checking everyone and every transaction, but focusing on major risks, identifying risks, major money flows. And also, if you take the construction sector, if there are, big European projects, if there are big government projects, that's the first indication that there could be some sort of trickery going on. If the amounts are small, if you know the company, if you know what they are doing, this should probably be checked. I mean, you can check them if there are any specific red flags raised by banks that are following the transactions initiated or implemented by these businesses. But banks have been using the risk-based approach for the past couple of years, and they're quite efficient at that already. So risk-based, meaningful approach, that's very important. But let's now engage those who have joined us remotely. Mr. Salko, what do you think about construction sector? What are your comments? Could I just briefly, make a general comment, a broader comment about focusing on major risks, on major sources of problems being undeclared work, of course, and I could fully echo what Madam Znotin said. We should focus on major risks. But the problem, though, is to get rid of undeclared work, we should have sufficient resources to counter that. And there should be horizontal cooperation between all relevant authorities. Yes, of course, when it comes to financial sector, the progress has been tremendous and the horizontal cooperation has been absolutely enviable, and laws were adopted very swiftly. And the same happened in 2008, 2009 during the financial economic crisis, when we were at the risk of becoming insolvent. As a country, we cut back the shadow economy quite significantly, and people from the United States came to advise us on how to do that. And we were under enormous international pressure, and we had to do something about shadow economy during the previous financial crisis. And we did it, we pulled ourselves together and we did it, made the progress. But there is no external pressure to cut back the shadow economy now anymore, so we have to somewhat find the will, internally, domestically, locally here. Unfortunately, the experience shows that without outside experience, we're less efficient in solving our problems. Although there are other ways to achieve progress and indeed, fill those huge gaps. We have the government resources. More horizontal cooperation is required, and that's where we can, find the necessary resources and means to find that. So that's why, we had this progress when we had the financial crisis, but unfortunately, after that, we're going to slip back into old practices and not really making any progress cutting back shadow economy. As regards to the construction sector is showing, promising signs as regards to reduction of shadow economy or grey sector. In 2015, it was 14% share. In 2018, it was 34%. In 2020, we got even less. So the trends are good. COVID hasn't had a huge impact, negative impact on that. One of the things that we should perfectly understand is that we need to be flexible. We need to constantly adjust the sort of the toolkits and the sort of the weapons that we are using to fight tax evasion or shadow economy and the construction economy in general. This 20-30 euros, that was the threshold which was defined a couple of years ago, and it's still effective, although the situation has changed. It's not as significant as it were a couple of years ago when we reached out to the National Construction Alliance. We need to review those thresholds. We need to review those tools in order to be able to more efficiently identify or detect undeclared work at the level of construction companies and cut back the shadow economy in the construction sector. Thank you, Mr. Sauka and Madam Salmi. What do you think about construction sector? Well, I'd say that, as Madam Janzeme already mentioned, we can achieve progress only through artificial intelligence and more automation. And if you take, for example, the construction sector, with huge shadow economy and undeclared work, there have been interesting developments. As State Revenue Service has access on more information about people employed at specific construction sites, the situation has been improving rather significantly. And although we have this general agreement with the construction sector, there are quite peculiar trends. Although we have minimum wage, they are playing around with working hours, so they are again trying to game the system through working hours. And as Madam Znostiny mentioned, there are very interesting approaches. You register a number of companies, you separate those cash flows, and AI can be used much more efficiently to root out this problem. And Ministry of Finance, with regard to construction sector, would like to propose to add more information to the construction information management system about the people employed, how much they are being paid. So Ministry of Finance, to avoid situation where money is not being used to pay legal wages, let's put it that way, and wouldn't tarnish the companies that have good reputation because of one-off sort of irregularity. We would like to also exchange information about transactions between construction companies, and more access we have to transaction information, the more access other relevant authorities have, the greater we use AI, the quicker we'll be able to catch the criminals and detect their crimes and exclude them from the economy. And Madam Janzem, just shortly, AI has been mentioned a number of times here. Without it becoming a philosopher's stone or the silver bullet that would solve all the problems, what would be the other measures that we could use with respect to construction sector?
Yes, I can say that, well, not only in the future, well, no sector has been taken off our agenda, and whatever we did during the pandemics, and we really made effort, and gained a lot from the databases of the Ministry of Economics. Also during the pandemic, nothing stopped in construction. We worked with the clients, and we see those incompatibilities, and we see the reports. We are focusing on this sector all the time, and we are trying to work with them, well, remotely, without leaving our offices, because we have artificial intelligence tools. Well, well, for the State Revenue Service, we had the problem for 2 years. We were engaged in something else, and the tax administration, we were not able to engage in our direct tasks, because we were also engaged in those support measures. But we have been making future plans, and we are well prepared now. We have artificial intelligence tools, so we can work from our desks. But now again, we'll be able to visit the companies, make on-site visits. But our main position is to do our homework, to do everything we can in the office, to disturb the companies as little as possible and to work as effectively as possible. It's not only construction, but also there are other sectors. But of course, I apologize all those users of the services, but we know with the taxes how situation changed, and we know the situation is changing fast as soon as we have information available in it's changing very fastly. But Miss Znotiņa.
Regulāri arī to, kas jau tiek darīts, un, protams, arī minēts.
We know that we have those new tools available, and this is all what we are doing here domestically. But what's going on internationally? Professor Sauka mentioned external pressure as well. But we will be speaking about international perspective during the second part of our forum, and we will take up this topic exactly in 10 minutes' time.
Izveidotu tīklu starpniecību. Kā izsekot noziedzīgi iegūtos līdzekļus un naudu, kas paredzēta terorismam, ja to apzināti slēpj un pārvieto no vienas jurisdikcijas uz citu? To palīdz risināt speciāli izveidotas iestādes FID.
Esiet sveicināti, cienījamie skatītāji.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. We're back after a short break.
Pievērsīsimies gan mazliet tematiski citādam, gan arī mēroga ziņā papildinātam jautājumam.
But we will resume with the second session and we will start with a different scale and different breadth. We will talk about the trends in AML policies and the international experience. And this is how we structured this forum. We started with the local domestic issues, and we will now start with, again, presentations from the international perspective. We'll then go to the local level, and we will have the presentations and the discussion with local experts here. We will share a special survey with you. We will now contact Daniel Telesclough, the former Moneyval chair and Swiss, and
Excellencies, Director of the FIU, dear Ilse, ladies and gentlemen. On 22 August 2018, I landed in Riga in my capacity as chair of Moneyval to inform the government of Latvia about the consequences of the poor results of the Moneyval operation. I also discussed measures to prevent Latvia from being grey-listed by the FATF. 18 months later, due to the great efforts of Latvian authorities, these consequences. I would like to mention here that Latvia was actually one of the few countries who have succeeded to doing so. Shortly afterwards, there was in another member state of Moneyval that was grey-listed by the FATF. And the Minister of Finance of that country informed us that this has cost the country over 5 billion euros. So all Latvians who helped at the time to avoid a grey listing have saved the country from great damage. What did Latvia do to achieve this success? On the first hand, I think Latvia has never been content with windows dressing. This was probably the biggest flaw in the previous system. The authorities and the financial institutions did not have a complete understanding of their risks, or they didn't want to have a complete understanding of their risks. They didn't quite understand how the Latvian financial sector can be exploited to launder the proceeds of crime, or have turned a blind eye on it. Only after a very thorough risk assessment process, the greatest risks were identified, and they were dealing with the intransparent transmission of funds from countries with high levels of corruption. These pass-through accounts were often combined with the danger that these instruments could be misused also to circumvent sanctions. Latvia, since 2018, has significantly mitigated the risks by greatly reducing the number of these high-risk accounts. To my knowledge, Latvia is one of the very few countries who had the courage to do this important step and to reduce its vulnerabilities. In this process, Latvia has also become aware of its significance as an international financial center. There is nothing wrong about offering financial services to non-residents, but you need to have the capacities and the political will to cooperate internationally on cases where the international financial center has been abused. And this has been the case. In a few years only, Latvia has evolved from an unknown entity to an active and credible partner. I think that Latvia is aware that there is no way back. A country that was once so close to the grey list will stay under observation for a long time. But the path you have chosen was not only the right one, it will also turn out to be a successful one. Latvia does not need to lend a hand to shady business. Such clients may bring high revenues on the short term, but in the long term it is harmful. And the countries that have willingly accepted ex-clients of Latvian banks will find this out painfully. As a result of the efforts of the authorities and of the financial sector, Latvia is now in a position to break new ground. The future of financial services lies in offering sustainable products. We see a shift of regulation to ensure that financial institutions give more regard to environmental, social and governance goals. But we also see a new generation of clients that do not want their bank to launder money. These are clients who want to ensure that their investments are sustainable. We see this clearly in our own work here at the United Nations University to mobilize the financial sector in ending human trafficking and modern slavery. A few weeks ago, we organized, together with the Latvian FIU, a virtual roundtable to which over 200 participants have attended. We sincerely thank the FIU for their cooperation. It will certainly advance our agenda, but I believe it is also an important building block on the way to become a sustainable, modern, and successful financial center. I commend Latvia for having taken these difficult decisions and for not deviating from this path. So it's good to be back in Latvia today, albeit virtually, and this time with good news. Thank you very much.
The former chair of the Moneyval and former head of the FIU of Liechtenstein and Switzerland, will going to continue with the international perspective, international evaluation of Latvian financial sector and its reforms. And now I'd like to transfer the floor to Yehud Schaffer, the former head of the FIU Israel and international expert.
The honor is mine. Your Excellencies, dear Ilse, thank you for inviting me. I, of course, agree with everything that Daniel Telesklav has said about avoiding the grey list. And I truly believe that it would be devastating if Latvia had entered the grey list 2 years ago, just before the COVID-19 pandemic. Just imagine what would happen today with all the sanctions on Russia, etc., if Latvia would still be perceived as this laundromat and center of sanction evading. I can just imagine what this would do to the Latvian economy. So indeed, grey listing was delisting or not being listed was a great achievement, but not at all the main achievement of Latvia in its anti-money laundering regime and what I want to speak about today. My background, I was an Israeli prosecutor for many years, and I was actually the Ilse Zlotina of Israel, told by Israel to set up the FIU and get out of the blacklist of FATF, which I did 20 years ago. I don't know if Latvia has thanked you enough, Ilse, but as we know, no prophet is welcome in his own hometown. But I've been privileged to consult Latvia for the last 2 years, and I have some perspectives which I want to share with you today regarding the achievements of Latvia. As I said, it's counterintuitive, but avoiding the grey list is not the main achievement of the anti-money laundering regime. And I know this from Israel, and from our experience, when many people in Israel believed that pecunia non olet, that the money does not smell and black money is good money for the economy. And as we learned, many lessons in Israel, which I want to share with you, with ignorant politicians preaching that black money is actually good for the economy and what are you doing, etc. What we learned in Israel, and which I think is very relevant for Latvia, is a few things. First of all, is that money laundering and laundromats add close to nothing to the GDP. So maybe a few bankers make some money, maybe a few tax advisors make some money, but overall GDP does not gain from this. A sustainable economy needs to be diversified and supported by a financial system with a high level of integrity. Foreign investment, the investment committees of the big money are attracted to stable and clean economies, transparent and growing economies, and not to places where money laundering occurs. And combating money laundering is the only way to combat actually crime, including especially corruption and tax evasion, and of course organized crime. And confiscation is what criminals really care about. As a prosecutor negotiating several plea bargains, I know the criminals are willing to stay in jail a few more years, just give them back their assets that we seized, and money is what what it's about, and preventing future crime is done through combating money laundering and confiscation. Above all, combating money laundering creates an equal level playing field, where honest businessmen can compete with dishonest businessmen and win, because otherwise, if criminals and tax evaders and money launderers can succeed, an efficient economy will not thrive. We can see this comparing short-term and long-term as well. Maybe we can get a few more million into the country on a short term, but on a long term, to ensure sustainability, we definitely need to fight money laundering. So for all these reasons, the effective combating of money laundering in Latvia has been most successful. And of course, if you're not convinced with all my reasonings, you can be convinced by the fact that Latvia was not grey listed and enjoys a good reputation which attracts foreign investment today. How did Latvia succeed? How did Latvia do it? Well, first of all, political will. I remember being in a meeting with the Prime Minister banging on the table, telling us all to leave the room, come back in 2 hours when the problem is solved. Without the involvement of the highest level of politicians, this would not have happened. Leadership, I have to mention Ilse, leading in the FIU, on the FIU level, the national level, and the international level, placing Latvia. Ilse Znotina was a leader in this process, and it would not have happened without her. But I also want to mention the good spirit of cooperation between all the agencies, which is not always true. I consult many agencies around the world in various jurisdictions. Sometimes in the small jurisdictions, actually, you have a phenomena where agencies are finger pointing at each other, looking for who to blame and what to blame. And actually, in Latvia, I saw a good spirit of cooperation between all agencies. I saw a strategic approach taken by all agencies, by the Ministry of Finance, the FCMC, the police, tax, the prosecutors, CNAB, and all those other supervisory authorities, everybody working under the same strategy, and which is something that is most commensable. So that is about the achievements of Latvia so far, and the question is how, what does the future intend, and how should we, looking into the future. First of all, the key word is sustainability. So everything that has been achieved must be sustainable and must continue, especially with regard to combating money laundering, regarding foreign proceeds of crime, abusing the Latvian system, and trying to launder funds to Latvia. This is especially true, as I said, during this era that we are going through now, these months, where sanctions are going to become more important, and various attempts to circumvent sanctions using money laundering schemes such attempts might happen in Latvia. But we also need to be, as the FATF tells us, we need to be risk-based, and I listened to the discussions before this speech. Clearly, everybody is trying to base their policies on risk assessments, meaning that we need to tackle tax evasion, the grey economy, corruption, and of course do this based on risk assessment and on a fine-tuned approach, focusing on the actual areas of residual risk where the mitigating measures are not strong enough. That's where we need to focus our enforcement. That's where we need to, through combined task forces or fusion centers or collaborations, various collaborations between tax, between CNAB, between the FIU, of course, with the leadership of the police and the prosecutors. This is where we need to move on. Remember, the FATF just revised its methodology and will be back. The Manival will be back sooner than you think. And what will be focused on, of course, is actual results, actual confiscations, actual investigations, actual prosecutions of money laundering cases with the predicate offenses of corruption, with the predicate offenses of tax evasion, and with the predicate offenses of foreign proceeds. So I do wish Latvia all the luck in the world in continuing in the same path that was followed in the last 2 years. This has been proven to be an excellent policy, both avoiding the grey list, but also building a sustainable economy, which will, in the long run, attract investment and ensure the economic stability and prosperity of Latvia. So good luck, FIU, good luck, Ilse Zlotina, and good luck, Latvia and its economy and all its authorities. I wish you all the best of luck and the best of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your expertise and time here today, and also evaluation. Thank you very much. Cienījamie skatītāji, tas bija Huda Šafers.
The audience, Yehuda Schaffer, spoke, expert assessor of FATF and former head of FIU of Israel. The next speaker, And the topic Ko vadis global trends and what can be expected in the area of AML in the coming years. Tom Keating, Director of the Center for Financial and Security Studies.
Hi everybody, my name's Tom Keating. I'm Director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. I unfortunately can't be in Riga with you all today. I had plans that meant I couldn't travel to Riga, but of course with the just appalling events that are going on in Ukraine, the completely unprovoked Russian aggression, invasion and war in that peaceful country, we are doing what we can from the UK to try and support particularly the sanctions effort that the UK and other countries are undertaking. And so can't be with you, and my thoughts are with you in Riga as well, because sitting on an island, we are some distance from Russia, but of course in Latvia you have a very, very close proximity to that country. So what I have been asked to do today, and when Ilse asks you to do something, you know the answer has to be yes, which I'm always delighted to respond to. What I've been asked to do today is to think about the title Quo Vadis, Global Trends and What Can Be Expected in the Area of AML in the Coming Years. I think that if we want to think about what's going to happen in the future, we do need to understand what's happened in the past. And having started this program at RUSI, the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, in 2014, so 8 years ago now, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what's happened in the past. After all, that's what we've been studying over the last 8 years. But before I come to that, as many of you know, I spent 20 years working at JP Morgan before I left in 2014. And these, on the wall behind me, these are cartoons, depictions of transactions that I worked on over that time. I was a capital markets banker and had a lot of contact with banks in the Baltic states, in places like Russia and Ukraine, as well, of course, across the rest of Western Europe. And it's worth, I think, for me anyway, thinking back about the kinds of work we did with these organizations back in those days, raising capital for them, helping them optimize their balance sheets, helping them with their payment access, their access to dollar clearing and all these sorts of things. And as some of you know, one of my early experiences in the financial crime world, or the financial crime risk world, was in my last year at JP Morgan, where I was part of a team that was reviewing the state of our relationships at JP Morgan with banks across Europe when it came to the quality of their deposits, whether we should be providing them with bank clearing services. And that brought me into conversations with central bankers, governors of central banks, where we had to explain why we were taking the risk decisions we were taking. One of the reasons, of course, that we were scrutinizing these relationships so closely was because we were watching what was happening to other banks. I'm sure we all remember what was happening to banks like HSBC in 2012, just 10 years ago, when it was fined for its money laundering issues in Mexico. Other banks around that time were also fined for facilitating sanctions evasion. And we've seen over the period, over the last 10 years, we've seen a series of banks find themselves scrutinized and then punished by supervisors and by authorities. And that obviously has driven up compliance standards. But also, we should also remember that over that period, countries have also found themselves under much greater scrutiny. We've just had on Friday the publication of the sort of final statement related to the FATF's strategic review. How is it going to go forward with its mutual evaluations in the next round? What will be the 5th round for FATF countries or the 6th round for Moneyval countries? But over the last 10 years, we've of course seen the output, the outcome of the 4th round of FATF evaluations, the 5th round for Moneyval. It always confuses me that Moneyval somehow managed to jump one number ahead. But anyway, you know what I mean. And of course, Latvia and many other countries have really benefited from that process. It's forced countries to look at the effectiveness of their financial crime standards and their financial crime approaches, and to do their best to avoid the grey list and to strengthen the integrity of their individual financial systems. During that time, we have seen some particular trends emerging. I very much like looking at the website of the FATF, where they publish the consolidated recommendations, the consolidated IO outcomes and recommendation outcomes for all countries after they've done their evaluations. And you can see quite clearly, the color coding shows you quite clearly where there are weaknesses. And I was pleased to see that the FATF had focused on these areas in its strategic review. So things like weaknesses across the globe when it comes to supervisors, particularly supervisors of DNFBPs. There are many countries that don't even have a DNFBP supervisor. We've also seen weaknesses in the DNFBPs themselves, in the accountants, in the lawyers, the estate agents, and so on. These are real vulnerabilities in the system. And certainly in my country, in the UK at the moment, when we think about the challenge faced by the country when it comes to dirty Russian money, it is these enablers, these DNFBPs, where the vulnerabilities really lie. We've also seen a big focus on beneficial ownership registries, so recommendation 24. This is another area where I think we're going to really see considerable scrutiny. I think the EU is doing a great job in pushing forward transparent beneficial ownership registries across the bloc. Latvia obviously is doing a good job in that regard. Not all countries are, and I think we need to make sure that there's pressure on those countries to ensure that transparency around the globe is improved, but not just transparency, but also the quality of the information. People often point to the register in the UK as a good example of a transparent register, but that transparency allows you to see some of the garbage that is in our Companies House register. So verification in the UK, for example, is a real weakness, or the lack of verification is a real weakness. So focusing on verification and transparency are obviously critical elements. And that's, I think, something that we will see a huge focus on in the coming years. Because as we're all learning, if information is not verified and if it's not transparent, at least transparent to the authorities, then the opportunity for money laundering and for general illicit finance activity is enormous. So when I look at what's ahead of us, I can see that the FATF is going to set us on a path that should improve supervision, particularly for DNFBPs, and improve transparency of company ownership and ultimate beneficial ownership registries. Of course, another area where there will be tremendous developments will be around cryptocurrencies. I don't intend to say very much about cryptocurrencies now. I think it's a topic which gets talked about a lot. But the bottom line is that I think we're going to have to move fast to make sure that we are focusing not just on the traditional financial sector, but also on this emerging metaverse, which of course is the new buzz phrase, because we could police the old world, the offline financial system as well as we like, but if we don't also police the online financial system, particularly in the case nowadays of ransomware attacks and kind of other forms of criminality happening online, then we will quickly find that we're missing a large portion of the threat that we face. So cryptocurrencies, I think, is another area that we need to make sure that we are smart on in the years ahead. Obviously, public-private partnership, a topic that is something we focus on extensively at RUSI. We would expect to see that continue to grow, but also the importance of using technology. How can you use technology to get as good a picture as possible of the risk landscape that you're operating in? I often feel as though if you're a bank, in particular if you're a bank, you're asked to make judgments based on so little information. It's like you're looking through a keyhole. Some of you might have heard me make this description before, but if I asked you what's in that room next door and all you can do is look through the keyhole, you'd have a very narrow view of what's in that room next door. If I opened the door and you could see everything that was in that room, well, you'd have a much better understanding of what is in that room. And at the moment, banks are really only able to look through the keyhole. And what we want to do, I think, using technology, is allow banks to see the entire contents of the room, to work together so that they can provide the best possible suspicious transaction reports for law enforcement. So I think public-private partnership, that's another area that we should be focusing on. RUSI is part of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime that is chaired by John Cusack, and we recently contributed a paper to an effectiveness study that has been published by the Global Coalition. I wrote the chapter on public-private partnership, and I'd really like to see public-private partnership taken to the next level over the next few years. And with that, of course, smarter, more intelligent ways of sharing information. And then perhaps the last thing I would say as I come to the end is that we mustn't get lost in the FATF recommendations themselves. We need to stand back sometimes and say, what are we trying to achieve when we think about the financial system? What are our objectives when we think about financial crime? It's very easy to get overly focused on passing the exam, but not really understanding what it is we're trying to do by passing the exam. And that is something that I hope that the European Union, through the AML package that was announced last year, through the establishment of its AML authority, and the various bits of regulation and architecture that are being developed, that's what I really hope we don't lose sight of. It's great to have these more joined up authorities, to have these more joined up information sharing, but let's remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to identify and disrupt illicit finance in the system. Getting a high score in the FATF evaluation, as certainly people in my country often like to trumpet, does not mean that you have a perfect system. We need to stop for a second and decide, what is it we want to achieve? We want to achieve a system that can identify dirty money effectively, that can confiscate assets, that can arrest people, and that can just ensure that, as they say, crime doesn't pay, dirty money doesn't pay. So with that, I've come to the end of my 10 minutes. I thank you all very much for your attention. I hope this was useful. As ever, I love hearing from people with questions, with comments, and with interest in our work. And it would be wrong of me to sign off without encouraging you all to subscribe to our podcast at RUSI. We have two podcasts. One is called the Suspicious Transaction Report. The other is called Financial Crime Insights. You can find them on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I believe Ilse is one of our biggest fans, and I hope she's still listening to our latest season. So do listen to that to stay on top of what we do at RUSI. Of course, you can also find us on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So with that, again, I've been Tom Keating, Director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. I wish you a great conference. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there. And here is hoping that we once again, as soon as possible, experience peace in Europe. Best wishes to you all.
Paldies, Keating kungam.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. And of course, a wonderful recommendation, 2 podcasts to listen to. And also the topics of the podcasts, these are linked to financial crimes, but you can find also similar podcasts also in Latvian, and you can find that on the webpage of FIU. And actually, the next topic was already mentioned by Mr. Keating, that's the European perspective and European scope. And this is, the next speaker is Nadia Long, Europol, the threats and challenges caused by organized crime in Europe.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for inviting Europol to this important event. And I would like to send a specific thanks to Ilse also from The Hague, the Netherlands. Although I would like to be with you today, I'm at least online, and I'm really happy to be with you. My name is Nadia Long, indeed. I work in the European Financial and Economic Crime Center, which was recently created at Europol to better support member states and third country partners in fighting, in particular, indeed, money laundering. Europol is the law enforcement agency of the Union. And unlike our title, I would say, we do not only support police, but also a number of different competent authorities involved in these important matters, such as customs and financial intelligence units and other specific forces. We also have a very strong discussion with our private party partners, in particular financial institutions. So we prevent and fight serious and organized crime by supporting investigations and supporting the activities of these competent authorities. And this is why we also gather, I would say, strategic information on trends, and we can provide you with some indications of what is important today in this landscape. But I would like to stress, first of all, that it's a very fast evolving landscape. And if we see some traditional ways of laundering money still, we also see some new developments. And I'm going to try to be a bit more specific here. First, I think it is very important to say that today, and this is what we see through these major investigations we are supporting, we are seeing the laundering of money in the EU and beyond at an unprecedented level, unfortunately. We have to be extremely vigilant, all of us, and this includes, of course, the private sector and the public sector. And if you combine the rise of different serious crimes in the Union, including money laundering, with some enablers or other phenomenon, such as the use of violence, which is clear these past years, and is observed throughout the EU, but also the misuse of legal entities and corruption, you come to very powerful organized crime networks that are clearly a threat for our economy and our societies. And I would just like to stress that from the information that has been reported to us, 60% of the criminal groups are engaged in corruption. So this is extremely important. It's an extremely important enabler. But also, more than 80% of criminal networks active in the EU use legal business structures for their criminal activities, and about half of them set up their own legal business in order to infiltrate business at the highest level. I would like to come back to what Tom was just mentioning as well, and although I'm no expert in cryptocurrencies, I of course have to mention this development. Now, we hear a lot about the increase of cryptocurrencies or virtual assets in money laundering and in the activities of organized crime in general. And this is indeed something that we observe when we support the member states in their investigations. Now, of course, cryptocurrencies are not illegal per se, and I think we need to make a big difference here, but they are more and more misused by criminals. For instance, we see that money laundering networks specialized in large-scale money laundering as a service have adopted cryptocurrencies and are offering their services to other criminals through these means. We also see that cryptocurrencies are increasingly used by criminals as means of payment of prohibited goods, such as drugs, or for an investment fraud currency. We are also particularly concerned about some specific high-value crypto assets, such as non-fungible assets or non-fungible tokens, which, as you know, are considered as well as work art, but for which we do not have yet the necessary legislation in place. However, I must also say that it's very difficult to estimate precisely the portion of illegal activities using cryptocurrencies. So I also have to moderate here my statement. And this is all the more true because criminals and criminal networks are still using traditional ways of laundering money and are still using fiat money. So we should not forget, and we see it also on a regular basis, the traditional forms and vectors of money laundering. We can assure you that cash is still king. We see a lot of cash into money laundering schemes, but also trade-based money laundering or the misuse of hawalas, for instance. And of course, the more we increase the regulation of financial flows, the more unregulated financial flows are used for criminal purposes. And in particular, of course, the means that use more anonymity, such as cash and cryptos. And again, taking the example of the drug trade, I must say that all these different means that I've mentioned are used clearly from the street level to purchase in production countries. So there is often a combination of different ways of laundering the money that is observed. And my final point, because of course we could stress many different trends, but I think it is very important to stress fraud. It's the fastest rising crime actually this past years. And it is often taken advantage, of course, of sudden changes in economic and social situations. And this is something that we will see. It's a bit early to say in what proportions, but we will see changes linked to the war in Ukraine, of course, also in the field of fraud. We have seen it in the past years with the COVID situation, and we see it now in post-COVID period of time. And here I would like to stress and really raise awareness on the recovery funds, both at national level and EU level. We all know that our economies have been made very fragile by this situation, and member states are putting a lot of efforts and money in trying to ensure the recovery of these economies, and so is the EU. We already see at national levels that fraudsters and organized crime are targeting recovery funds. And we foresee that this, of course, will as well happen with the EU Next Generation Fund, which is worth more than 800 billion euros. Where there is money, organized crime is, of course, attracted. And we should make sure that we are aware of the high risk in subsidy fraud, in procurement fraud, in the use of certain enablers. I already mentioned corruption, but there is also document fraud, the abuse, of course, of legal business structures, and a number of, I would say, criminal activities throughout the chain. And that's why the prevention, the auditing, the control of the procedures, and of course, opening investigations on these types of crime is extremely important. So I would like to end here my presentation, but of course, I'm open to any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Nadia Long, and Nadia will be back with us also in the discussion we have after the main session of second part of our conference. Paldies, Nadia Longai, viņa būs ar mums arī.
Thank you, Nadia Long, once again. Nadia will join us again for the discussion that will follow all the presentations that we'll have in the second session. We have to keep abreast with global trends, with world trends, European trends that have finally reached us. And now let's talk about Latvian trends here in AML policy. What should the businesses here expect is something that Lee Clavin from the Ministry of Finance, she is the Undersecretary of the State responsible for fiscal policy, is going to tell us about. Good afternoon, dear participants. I'd like to start by thanking FIU for organising this prominent forum, and would like to, on behalf of the Ministry of Finance, just briefly walk you through the main trends, AML trends, and how these trends are factoring into our policies, and as Mr. Douglas mentioned, what businesses should take into account with regard to changes that they could expect in future from the AML policies. I have prepared a short presentation, and I would like to start by focusing your attention on how we see main factors that are contributing or somewhat influencing AML policies in the coming years, next year, and medium term, in the next 3-year period. Next slide, please. I would like to start by underlining that Ministry of Finance, which is a part of this overall policy, plays major role in making this policy, and Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Interior is also responsible for that, but we are the main responsible authority that is responsible for legislative initiatives with regard to AML law and AML policies, and we are very actively cooperating at the European level, because Europe is also very actively debating possible changes at the EU level. And I would like to start by mentioning that recently we've been hearing a lot that what we did in the past 2 years has been admirable. We have overhauled AML regulatory framework, which has impeded businesses and slowed down probably the economy despite the progress and the success and us going from one extreme to another. So those of you who expected that we might loosen those requirements or revoke these requirements, bad news for you. We're not going to do any of that. We are going to just continue along the same lines as we did before. We're going to develop this legal framework even further to support successful growth of Latvia and successful development of specific sectors and the way we work on a daily basis. Because of course, if we look internationally, globalization, international trade, free trade, of course, requires us to develop standards for knowing your partner, knowing your clients, so that there is no difference, so that we use harmonized standards, so that we have shared understanding of what is the problem that we are dealing with and how to cooperate. And if you again take the swift changes that have sort of swept the world, our country in the past 2 years, what I would like to focus your attention on again is that we shouldn't expect in coming years any changes with regard to the sort of the course that we have identified for ourselves. There's going to be no changes in the regulatory framework. We just need to raise the awareness, improve the understanding of what are the requirements, what are the rules. Probably additional training will be put in place here and there for the financial and the public sector to be better aware of what the requirements actually imply and how these requirements can be applied in practice in the light of the international standards and international frameworks and how to benefit from them. Now, another source of changes would be virtual assets. Innovations, of course, have their pros, multiple pros and advantages, but of course there's the downside as well, as previous speakers mentioned. We have to be aware of the cons as well. Those virtual assets, they are decentralized by nature, so there's a lot of room for anonymity and a lot of room for abuse, and therefore to avoid that we need additional regulation, additional rules for those enablers to be able to operate legitimately with virtual assets. Another factor that I would like to single out is a swift development of digitalization or swift digital transformation, which has been again triggered by COVID. New services have been cropping up like mushrooms after rain, and the existing services are being digitized, and AML framework will most definitely be adjusted to this new digital situation, new digital world, realia, so that we can apply them to the conventional, traditional services equally as to the new innovative tools. And of course the geopolitical changes and sanctions will have certain influence. That's another sort of growing trend that we must factor in, and that's a factor that is here to remain. And sanctions, targeted sanctions and sanctions against sectors will definitely sort of drive our work in the coming months, years. Even if you're not responsible for AML, this is something that you will have to take into account, and you will have to somewhat comply with those requirements in one way or another. The new thing is the EU AML reform, which brings us good news as well. This kind of reform at the European Union level will give us a harmonized regulatory framework. There are going to be no disparities between the member states, which will make life easier for companies that are working on a cross-border scale. They will benefit from harmonized regulatory framework, which will definitely reduce the sort of legal costs or any costs of operating in several member states at the same time. And another advantage is this new regulatory framework, this new system, will make sector players reconsider their risk appetite, whether risk appetite needs to be adjusted and probably downgraded. Of course, these additional requirements will come with additional costs for the private sector, and some of the private sector players will probably lose some of the clients because they're too expensive. Now, as regards to Latvia having a very solid basis on which to build on its further AML success and what are the benefits instead of just whining about overcomplication and complicated rules and regulations. What I would like to specifically underline is that there's significantly reduced AML risk, especially in financial sector, are giving us a very good basis to build on and think about utilizing our economy and funding, for another push, again, looking outside towards east. The transparency of legal entities is something that we need to provide. Know your partner is the new mantra, if you will, so that we know what final beneficiaries we are working with, who's our partners, are they transparent enough to avoid any problems or complications due to lack of information or clarity about your partners. Also, account register, PEP register is also another advantage of our system here locally, which makes compliance a lot easier. And of course, another contributing factor is the better monitoring capacity of responsible authorities and controlling capacity of monitoring authorities, the capacity to explain what compliance implies and what those standards imply and how to fight crime, specific types of crime and criminals. This is something that also has yielded good results. And also PPP, public-private partnership is again, one of the advantages of Latvia. We were the first ones to again champion the PPP and the AML sector. And this is something that, again, we can build on and that we can promote around Europe and can transfer to other European countries. Public sector has a very good opportunity to cooperate with private sector in fighting AML. And the last item that I wanted to underline is that we've heard a lot that companies should, need more information about what assets, what country has to avoid red tape. We have reached an agreement in principle about public databases and how those public databases can be shared with the private sector so that there is a sharing of information to avoid redundant bureaucratic steps, going through each register and checking so that those registers and databases would be integrated and easily accessible. I would like to conclude by underlining that right now we shouldn't really expect these requirements or rules to be cut back or revoked. We shouldn't expect any of that. We should rather think about smart compliance, smart application to show other countries that our successes are a good basis for building, making further steps and enhancing our growth in future and strengthening the AML system. Thank you for your attention. Wish you a productive remaining part of the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Kļaviņa, for very focused perspective. But now we turn to our discussion, and the topic for it is what should be the main homework for this year, priorities for 2022. The participants: Ilze Notiņa, Head of the Financial Intelligence Unit; Armands Ruks, Chief of the State Police; Nadia Long, Senior Specialist, European and Financial and Economic Crime Center, Europol, who was already with us with her presentation, and Igor Gerasimins, European Delegated Prosecutor, EPPO. Of course, we are speaking about I wouldn't say very long time frame. We are now speaking about short term, and these are the coming years. And I have a very sort of humane question to you. You, as heads of institutions, representatives of institutions, what do you have on your desk? The list of your priorities. And what's your opinion? What is the homework that the state, the companies should do? And let's ask Ms. Notiņa to start. I believe I have been reiterating it already, what we are planning as FIU. We are working with financial institutions on the process of liquidation. And we are now also dealing with the second risk profile, or those crimes that generate illicit assets here and in Europe. Fraud, smuggling, tax evasion, all these crimes which impact all of us and in general the welfare and prosperity of the state. It was already mentioned in the previous discussion. We are speaking about cyber muscles. We are planning to grow our cyber muscles and abilities. We are planning to open AML Innovation Center, and FIU is planning to cooperate very closely and in different quality with local institutions and also internationally. We really have to speak also about what Professor Sauka said, expanding our cooperation, working more intensively, not to speak only about AML as a success story for Latvia, as Ms. Kļaviņa right now indicated, but we should also deal with other issues on the same in the same quality. Mr. Rooks, well, first of all, thank you for the possibility to participate in this forum in this time, which is not simple for us. But I would like to outline, first of all, the problems, or the root of the problem, historical development of the state. If we look 30 years back, when all these companies were being established and the financial system was set up, and how the business was developing. At the very beginning, we saw people appearing in business environment who were optimizing processes, optimizing taxes, and so on. And we see that these traditions continue. We still see these traditions in the country. And the next point which we see, we see lack of awareness in society that legalizing of proceeds of crime is a very serious crime. If we look into the criminal law in the specific section, we see that this is qualified as a serious or a particularly serious crime, depending on the activities. And the third point, also, the ability of the state is very important. The ability not only to combat, but also to explain to our inhabitants how we have to understand that times are changing, the state is developing, we want to be a highly developed state. We want our inhabitants to have more possibilities, to have social benefits, social care, to have excellent roads, to have excellent system of education, to have prosperity after all, and to have equality in the country, also financial equality. And we should, of course, also lower this threshold of poverty. But all those companies who are not paying taxes, all those who are trying in some ways to act in a criminal way, also by optimizing those proceeds of crime, they all should understand that this is a serious crime and a particularly serious crime. As regards other criminality or criminals, for these people, if we look at the predicate crime, these are usually crimes related to drugs, excise tax, tax evasion, also corruption. These are the predicate crimes linked to money laundering. And those people who are involved in this business, of course, they also develop in their actions, they transform their criminal activities. We see that they are moving into digital environment, into cyber environment. They are using all the possibilities offered by the dark net. They are using the possibilities of paying on those dark platforms by using cyber currencies. And in this year, we are planning to strengthen our capacity in cyber environment, as also was mentioned by Ms. Notiņa. And here we have an analytical tool. We have tested it. And we are not, I'm sorry, the sound is disappearing at some moments. Apparently there's an analytical tool that allows tracing crypto transactions in cryptocurrencies. And this would also provide the possibility to have evidence and proof of criminal activities. So, because we also need those parallel financial investigations, we have to prove the criminal origins of assets. I'm sorry, we are not getting any sound. Just to outline, we are the first supranational institution of prosecution uniting member states with the central level on Luxembourg and decentralized level which I represent and my other colleagues. We really appreciate cooperation with the Financial Intelligence Unit. We really want to thank for this possibility to work so closely with FIU. Because also our work that we do, it's very close to this analytical work and financial investigation. This was just mentioned that these parallel financial investigations are conducted. Our priorities, as far as I know, the annual report is being prepared by the European Public Prosecutor's Office to submit to the Commission and to the Parliament to prove that this institution, which started its activities last year in July, that we have already achieved certain results and that they can work. Of course, our basic competence is everything related to EU funds, but not only. This also includes corruption and money laundering. I know there have been discussions whether the competence should be expanded, also including other supranational crimes. But we have to keep in mind that all the cases related to EU funds, this is a high risk area, and this is also shown by risk assessment. And the second point is we have to reinforce cooperation with national institutions, and I mean not only FIU, but also investigatory institutions related to administration of EU funds. And we are planning to conclude a memorandum of agreement to have not only formal cooperation but also informal. And I also have to say that FIU said, and it was said also mentioned by Mr. Schaffer, it's one thing to have a good team, but another thing is that the team works as a team. And we've seen this in Latvia, we see this in the coordination group, in PPP, all these models which are really needed. And the third point is also increasing the capacity of the European Public Prosecutor's Office. We really are developing our internal resources, analytical capacity, and of course this is a new institution. We have to find employees. It's not so easy. And of course these are the teething problems for all newly established institutions. Thank you. According to our plan, we wanted to ask Nadia Long to participate at the very end, but judging by the body language, you are following the discussion very closely. So my question to you, Nadia, now, from the perspective of Europol, the capacity of cooperation and collaboration between different institutions, how these institutions should collaborate and closely. So your assessment, what could be done better to improve this ability or capacity to cooperate on European level?
Thank you very much for this question, and indeed an interesting discussion. I'm trying to follow as much as possible. I think it is very important indeed that we strengthen, and I think this is a word that has come up between all panelists, we strengthen our capacity to fight money laundering, but financial crimes in general. And this is something that Europol is also working on. As I said, we created this new center we call FEC, Financial and Economic Crime Center, not so long ago. So we are still in a strengthening process. I would say, although the fighting money laundering, preventing and fighting money laundering has been in the mandate of Europol for around 20 years, but we see that there's still indeed a lot to do in this area, and the results are still not there, not only in terms of money laundering investigations, but also in terms of asset recovery, which I think is a very important ultimate point, I think, of the chain. So in order to do so, we do see margins of improvement between public authorities, between national authorities and Europol, but also in a more comprehensive approach, cooperation between the prevention and the enforcement side. And there I go back to what many speakers have already mentioned. I think the strengthening of public-private partnerships is an extremely important topic. It goes a bit, I would say, further than the traditional way of law enforcement to look at cases and at strategic information. But by working together, we would definitely have a better view on what's going on, and we will be more prepared to reply to all these challenges. So I think what we see now is that the information available that is cross-border in money laundering cases, I would say probably to around 90%, is not shared enough nor analyzed enough, that the cross-matching between focused financial information, and of course I'm talking here within all the legal frameworks, data protection frameworks that exist, the cross-matching between financial intelligence and criminal intelligence is still not done enough. Probably at national level, but certainly at EU level. And therefore, we believe that the new package that is coming up is clearly an opportunity to improve the situation. Available information should be used. And we foresee long discussions on how Europol and the new AMLA, for instance, are going to cooperate in the future. We really hope that the maximum cooperation will be possible. We want to strengthen, of course, the cooperation with the FIUs who are essential in this area and who are competent authorities for Europol. So we see a lot of reasons to hope. But we are working hard in order to be able to improve this situation and come to better results. Thank you.
Paldies, Nadia Long.
Thank you, Madam Long. Question, comprehensive cooperation, that's all, perfectly understandable. But I wanted to refer to what Mr. Rux said about, raising public awareness, educating people. Which are the most vulnerable groups that we should focus on, who fall victim to these crimes? I'm not talking about people who make this choice on purpose, who decide to abuse or game the system. It's their choice, they're willing to pay the price. But what about the victims, innocent victims who get pulled into these schemes? How to make them better aware of what they are potentially exposed to? Mr. Rux? Well, I would like to focus your attention on a very interesting phenomenon that we've been observing more increasingly in recent years, involving youngsters, young people, making them money mules. I'm talking about young people who, for a rather small fee, as a way to earn some pocket money, some walk-around money, are getting involved in becoming money mules. You don't have to do anything difficult, just withdraw some money from the cash. We'll give you a credit card, just withdraw some money from the ATM and you will get, a small fee for that. All very simple. And unfortunately, young people fall for this. They are not really aware that this is illegal. They know that this is something unusual, but they are not fully aware that it is illegal, that they have become a part of money laundering scheme. and they will or might be held accountable. And this is something that we should rather try to explain to young people who understand how financial sector works, how money works, and how financial services work. I think this is, 12th year that we should start reaching out to them, approaching them, and then also target students, university students as well. So these would be the sort of two age groups that we should focus on. Not only young people, but also the people of all ages fall victims or get, pulled into criminal schemes without being fully aware of what they are agreeing to. Although they know that they will profit, they'll get a small fee. It might not be entirely illegal, is what they think, but they are not aware of the accountability or the liability. So this is something that we should focus on. We should focus on youth, and of course we should also focus on business owners. Public sector is very much dedicated to eradicating corruption risks and working with corruption, all kinds of corruption and the impact of corruption. The public sector is very much focused on whistleblowing and reporting, and there is progress. You can't accuse us of not doing anything, and police, when we hire new officers, when we talk to youngsters, we not only talk about the harm of drugs and other and sort of negative impact of other crime, but also when talking to NGOs, we also try to convince them that it is important to focus on these negative consequences. But if you take businesses that are optimizing tax, looking for tax savings, agreeing to suspicious procurement schemes, rigged bids and so on and so forth, especially considering that we will have RRF funding available, Resilience Recovery Facility funding available. We need to protect, this money in a way, and we have to make everyone aware that each cent or each euro that they steal will make our country weaker, will cost more in law enforcement resources, prosecutor resources, and international resources. We can thank Europol for all the support. Of course, we have wonderful cooperation with you, and also with Eurojust we have excellent cooperation. We're working very closely together on investigation, but awareness raising and education is something that we could collaborate much closer on. And also we can use social media. People are much more tuned into social media, and everyone, and we should draw their attention by using screaming headlines, anti-money laundering is destructive and so on and so forth, to make society in general more aware of the harm this crime does. For me as a police officer, irrespective of what kind of crime we're dealing with, I always feel that we should prevent people from committing these crimes, and by raising awareness we can do so. We can avoid them being pulled into those crimes. Yes, we should not only save people from drowning in the river, we should also make sure that they are not falling into the river at the estuary. So, and there are channels that we can use to communicate with them, and there are also digital channels, I assume. So how has anybody who's recruiting youngsters been caught, and what are the figures really? What are the statistics? Because people might think that there's 1-2 guys who'd been caught, but what is the sort of the magnitude of the problem that at hand? Well, this was actually the subject that I wanted to touch in my final remarks, and Mr. Rooks mentioned youngsters as one of the risk groups. According to our survey, according to our polling that we conducted, we have concluded that youngsters indeed, compared to other age groups, are least aware of the harms or the threats or the negative consequences of being involved in crimes such as, for example, money laundering and becoming a money mule. Another thing is that compared to 2018, only 7% of all the criminals that were prosecuted for money laundering were youngsters aged 19 to 24. In 2021, it increased to 14%. So number of youngsters caught laundering money has increased and they are being sent to jail for that. So that requires major public awareness campaign. And this campaign in particular is to also raise the awareness among youngsters. And as a head of the FIU, I would like to also remind you that through such awareness-raising campaigns, we try to tell youngsters how to help their parents and grandparents, because there's another sort of group of victims. They are not money mules. They are not involved in money laundering, but they fall victims to criminals, and mostly older people are defrauded, and Russian-speaking population is another target for example, phone fraud as well. And there is some romantic aspect to the fraud as well. Social media being used by men, to lure in women, with promises of true love forever. But then they ask, send me some money so that I can travel to you and meet you. So these are the vulnerable groups that we still need to continue reaching out to, and one of the ways to do so is just to use a very simple language in a sort of comprehensible way to give them, advice, which is exactly what we're trying to do here today. And yes, indeed, this is something that we are aware of with the popular film Tinder Swindler as well. So anyway, going to the European Prosecutor's Office, cash flows, and if we refer to the Bible and snake in the Garden of Eden, so we have put things in order, in this corner. We've made things better here. But where's the biggest pressure of dirty money? On which sectors? Which sectors are on your radar, not probably today, but also thinking about tomorrow? Well, one thing that I want to definitely underline is something that I said about the EPPO, European Prosecutor's Office. There's a great pressure of dirty money on European Union funds or European projects. But there's also the National Risk Assessment, which is a very good sort of document from the point of view of weaknesses identified therein, tax fraud, any other fraud, excise goods that are actually under the pressure of dirty money or sort of generate dirty money that is then being laundered. And I very much liked what Nadia said about prevention. I think that is something that we often forget as a sort of useful tool. But it has, again, resurfaced more recently. Prosecutors and investigating officers, and I can agree here with Mr. Rups, should be more aware that, when we get the case, it's actually sort of the end of story, and we have to sort of backtrack the story, understand, how this case ended up on our table. And we often go to training, which is organized by GPO and the European Prosecutor's Office, EPO, which is very much focused on understanding, how prevention works. So that we could, as prosecutors, identify potential crime early on and avoid this case ending up on our table before it being handed over to the court. So everyone must work together. Instead of just focusing on what we are supposed to do, we should look at the whole picture, to have a sustainable system instead of focusing on short-term goals. We should work with causes for the crime. That's how the prevention works. And if I may, I would like to go back to public awareness raising issue as well. Mr. Rooks said, that our collective memory is very strong, and these, issues, with sort of our legal awareness, judicial awareness, that is something very important. And as regards to EU funding fraud, some people have this, wrong perception that it's an easy money that comes from outside. It's not owned by anyone, so there's no harm. I mean, there's no victim, so there's no crime, and nobody's losing anything if I just pocket it. No project application is actually written with an idea to take the money from somebody away. It's just a matter of awareness and loyalty towards our country. Just feeling that you shouldn't overstep any boundaries. And it's not about balancing or any grey areas, really. Often we talk about grey or shadow economy, and last week we had a training where we specifically discussed that, the double morale or double standards, nobody can do that, but I can. But you shouldn't do it either. That's not how it works. So that's a matter of awareness. We talked about horizontal multi-agency cooperation, about their awareness. But what about the public awareness? I mean, what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to cooperate. But do other institutions? I mean, RRF will be channeled through various institutions responsible and paying authorities and so on and so forth. How well are they aware of the problem? And don't mention the obvious sort of examples like Ministry of Finance and so on and so forth. But what about the public sector institutions other than you?
Of course, I will just confirm your suspicion that indeed all those present here understand these matters, but we cooperate, in the context of the Ministry of the Interior, the State Police. Of course, we cooperate with other ministries, including the Ministry of Finance. And we met people who are supervising EU funds. And we were discussing these matters. How should we act? How should we reinforce the possibility to prevent optimizing or wasting of those allocated funds? And I believe it's very important to have proper risk assessment. Risk assessment in the context of those sectors where these funds are being channeled into. Let's say, take an example, also Procurement Supervision Bureau, their capacity to understand, and also those structural units and people who are responsible for procurements. They should understand what should be done, how the capacity should be increased. And of course, training is needed, that's clear. Training is needed. And also this forum, in a way, is training. Of course, we have other formats, events organized by the prosecutor's office, by FIU. We have different interinstitutional trainings involving different institutions. And this is the way towards improvements. There's no other way. We have to start with education, awareness. And the second point is equally important, what was just mentioned by the colleague, this loyalty to the state, that's patriotism. Among young people and among companies, or when a civil servant or an official, if they take some kind of remuneration, even you benefit, you are inflicting harm upon society, upon the state. And when the majority of people understand it and identify themselves with the state, and I will start by trying to dissuade people from engaging in criminal activities. And this is what we should be aiming for. And our young people, they will become businessmen, they will become officials, they will be developing and creating our financial and business environment. I will give the possibility now to Nadia to conclude our conversation, and the question is, looking from the Europol European perspective, sort of your philosophical view. Well, it's a philosophical question. Is it a fight with a multi-headed dragon? You cut off one head and then the Bitcoin head grows. Or can we see good progress, and are we approaching the day when we might say that this sphere has been, well, brought into order to a large extent and no major work to be done?
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I think, well, the new legislative package shows that year after year, we try to improve the situation, but the problem is still here. And I think as your discussion shows, you have to tackle this problem from different angles. Prevention is certainly one of them. Enforcement is another one. And by working together, I think we can make the situation better. And this is a daily work. I do think that heads are growing up again, unfortunately, when we manage to cut one. I do think as well that criminals are opportunistic and that vulnerable situations, people or situations, will lead to new types of criminal activities. So we have to be extremely flexible and vigilant. And I think what you were mentioning about vulnerable people, which I completely concur with, absolutely. There's also an absence of knowledge that you tackled. And there are some public bodies who are not aware, indeed, of the ins and outs of how organized crime operates, for instance. And we have the duty also to raise the awareness, also of the private sector in terms of handling businesses that could be risky. And there, the national, but also the supranational risk assessments are, of course, extremely important. The role also of the industry associations to raise awareness amongst their members of the risks. So I think in order to, in other words, to come to better results, you really need to tackle this from different sides. And you really need to have all these different partners working together. The law enforcement feeding into prevention, the prevention feeding into law enforcement work as well. That would be my input on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia Long from Europol.
Un, protams, paldies arī mūsu pārējiem.
And of course, I thank also other participants of this discussion. Igor Gerasimins, European Delegated Prosecutor, Armands Ruks, Chief of the State Police, and of course, Ilze Znotiņa, Head of the Financial Intelligence Unit. But this is not yet the end. We will rearrange the studio. And so I invite now Ilze Znotiņa to come for the concluding words, but this time the concluding words will be slightly different, not only conclusions about this forum, but also Ilze Znotiņa will speak about the survey data, citizens' attitude towards financial crimes and legalization of the proceeds of crime. So the survey data are very important in order to really work with the findings made today. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, and thank you, my colleagues, for this wonderful discussion. I'm so sorry that we cannot talk longer with our colleagues because this atmosphere of this forum really shows that over 4 years we have succeeding in doing a lot. I remember when I met Igor Gerasimins 5 years ago, when I was for the first time involved in dealing with these matters, because I headed the team which was preparing the national risk assessment. I remember Igor's, he was representing the Prosecutor's General Office of Latvia, and at the time we were rather suspicious towards each other. Well, it's just all of us, we were silent and trying to understand why we needed to do this, but the situation is radically different now. Not only here in Latvia, we have learned how to cooperate and how to trust each other and how to be friends, but we have also gained wonderful friends like Nadia Long from Europol and also Daniel Telesklav, former Moneyval head. He was recently also in Latvia because he is now also in an institution combating human trafficking. We have different NGOs, RUSI, represented by Tom Keatings, and Yehud Schaffer, our friend who has followed our progress for several years. We have Ministry of Finance and also Finance and Capital Markets Commission. And no one now believes that the work that we are doing is exaggeration. Actually, last year we were all locked in by the pandemic, and we decided to conduct a survey to understand what is the attitude towards financial crimes and money laundering. So we understood as a result of this survey, this is already the fourth forum that we have been organizing. And in 2018, we were working a lot with law enforcement institutions, with DNFBFs. Then we started working on public awareness raising. Last year we had different blocks of the campaign, but this year we understood that young people is the age group which should be addressed in particular. As Mr. Ruxos said, young people are our future, and they are able either to make us more prosperous and let us live in a more secure state and world, or just to the contrary. And we understood that we had to organize a campaign, and the title is "You are offered easy money, stop and think." So we did this because this survey showed that in general public awareness of money laundering is quite high. Well, in scale of 10, if we ask what you think, what's your opinion, what kind of impact money laundering, corruption, drug dealing and smuggling has on the standard of living, we see that corruption and money laundering is perceived as a very serious problem. We see here on the slide 8.5 and 8. These are the results. And here we see also tax evasion, 7.9. And according to the national risk assessment prepared by FIU, these have been identified as major categories of risk. But we also have other data. We see that in general 66% of citizens believe that these groups of criminal offences impact all of us directly, our well-being and national and also the national security. But we see that only 41% of young people admit or recognize that these situations threaten both these young people and our state and economy and well-being. So this shows that young people have not yet understood this very close link or interconnection between these criminal offences and the quality of life and prosperity. So this means that young people should be informed not only how not to become engaged, not to fall into the traps of organized crime and money laundering, but until now, for law enforcement institutions, we had very few possibilities somehow to address these groups, because the focus of the state was different. We treated more liberally tax evasion and corruption to a larger or smaller scale, and also money laundering. Perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, only few people knew about it, and even this concept was not known. But now we see that all this sort of work that has been invested into it shows the results. because in 2018, 7% of apprehended offenders were in 2018, and in 2021 already 14%. So this means that young people are indeed targeted. So we have this campaign, you are offered easy money, stop and think. And this forum is the opening activity or the launching activity for the entire campaign. We have prepared five videos, 5 explanatory case descriptions, and 5 thematic tasks. Yesterday, I gave a lecture to teachers in the form of a webinar, allowing to educate school students, perhaps also university students, to show the examples how one can fall into the traps of these criminals. And also I was explaining what the teachers should do, how to explain what should be done. All these videos are available on our webpage. They can be downloaded or streamed. And what we want to, the message that we want to give through these videos is that criminal schemes can be identified, and it's possible to inform about these others. We also have to assess critically the circumstances of each transaction, and we should avoid the easy money and help also other people to avoid such situations. Well, you know, we have to help to identify fraud, because fraud is very directly linked to money laundering, and also it's very closely linked to the well-being of all people around us. I would like to thank all of you for following this forum so closely, for participating. I would like to thank all our speakers who provided both insight what has happened during the last 5 years, and also talked about future and what should be done in the future. And I would like to conclude with the words that I said at the very beginning. It's our task to build a safe state and a safe world. And here, by being friends, by developing these mechanisms of cooperation based on our common values, peace and cooperation, this will help us avoid those disasters that we are experiencing now. Thank you. Thank you, Ilze Znotiņa, for these inspiring words, not only by giving practical recommendations, but also by speaking about it as values, and really asking all of us to understand what safety and security means and what we need to ensure it. Thank you. We held this forum on the premises of the Ministry of the Interior. Thank you to all the participants, and thank you to all of you who followed us on different streaming platforms. Please follow the campaign, know the byways of money, and really let's try to notice what's happening, honest things, dishonest things, and let's build our country together.